Well, this is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, also known as, by the New Testament times, we talked about this before, the whole feast was called Passover. This is the Passover feast. We understand that because there is a clear connection between the Passover offering, and it was an offering to the Lord. It was not just something that was done out there in the local communities. I'm talking about after Egypt. It was something done at the tabernacle. It was it was in a central location there, and later at the temple, of course. And that's what kicked off the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you can understand why it came to be called, the whole feast came to be called the Passover feast. That's why the Jews, when they they get together on, like last night. We have the night to be much observed. They have their Passover Seder. As I understand of it, many of them begin it in the afternoon of the 14th and go into the night with it. But nevertheless, we understand the connection between the Passover sacrifice and the Feast of Unleavened Bread itself. You can't separate those two as far as their meaning is concerned. Some people say, well, no, the Passover sacrifice, it's supposed to be separate because it commemorates or calls to memory the night of terror in Egypt, and it's a somber occasion. But then the next night, they think that the early 14th was when the Passover was offered. It was not, but that's what they believe. And then the next night, then that's when the party begins. Somber one night, whooping it up the next night. So that's not really the way it works. It's actually the Passover recalls what happened in Egypt, and so does the following night, the very following night, from the end of the 14th when the Passover was offered until that night when it was eaten, which is the beginning of the 15th. So we understand all of that. But have you ever noticed, though, that talking about the Exodus, and this is what we're talking about here, this is what resulted in the Exodus, what caused Pharaoh to release the children of Israel. But have you ever noticed, as you're reading through the Torah, you're reading through the law of Moses, you see references to the Exodus come up over and over and over again. You can't get through many pages without a reference to the Exodus. God keeps calling the people's mind to the fact that He is the one who brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And this is emphasized. For example, look at Exodus 20. We won't turn there, but I'll just call your attention to it. How does it begin? How does the Ten Commandments, how do they begin? They begin with, I am the Lord your God, who did what? Called you, brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And you see this again. You just read through the Torah. Read through the law of Moses, and you will see this come up over and over and over again. And of course it comes up in this season. This season's it's all about that. And but you notice it says, land of Egypt, house of bondage. House of bondage. So what really does this feast picture? It really is a feast of freedom, isn't it? A feast of freedom, because it pictures, for ancient Israel, their freedom, their liberation from Egyptian bondage, so that they could go out now and freely worship God, follow His ways. And of course, freedom depended on on their faithfulness to God. Apart from God, apart from faithfulness to Him, there is no freedom. We hear about liberty within law, liberty in law, not just not liberty from law, but liberty in law. That's what Israel had before them. So this is a feast of freedom, a feast of freedom. And what I want to do today is go back to Exodus 12, just look at some basic information here, things that probably most of us know, but we might pick up a few additional nuggets along the way, especially things that become controversial and have been controversial over the years. But as I read through this, I'll just comment on some of those things along the way. Exodus 12. In verse 1, this is our text for the day, Exodus 12. If you want a text for the day, it's Exodus, the whole chapter. We may not read every verse, but we'll go through a substantial portion of it. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their fathers' houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You already see the symbolism, don't you? We understand the symbolism of that. Of course, we have the advantage of living on this side of the sacrifice of Christ, and we know He's the Lamb of God, a lamb without blemish, so you can see the symbolism here already. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it, meaning the lamb, until the 14th day of this month, which the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lamb. This translation says, at twilight. But that's not a good translation. I think you'll find most Hebrew scholars would tell you that actually it's not restricted to that period of time called twilight. That's between sunset and dark. It's a little broader than that. The word there would be ben-ha Shemeshot or something like that. I can't remember now exactly the name. But this word is ben-ha Arbayim. I pronounce it Arbayim. I think it's more like a ben-ha Arbayim or something like that. But in any case, it means, the technical meaning is between the evenings. Between the evenings. And we'll comment on that a little later. But I want you to notice it says, take it and keep it up until the 14th day of this month. Some have tried to make the claim that what that means is you keep it up until the 14th, and as soon as the 14th starts, that's when you got to kill it. It doesn't mean that. Because, it said until the 14th, it's telling you that on the 14th is when it's to be killed. On the 14th, it says it doesn't mean it has to be killed right away, or, oh, it's too late. What if you wait till the afternoon? Oh, too late. That's silly. It doesn't say until the 15th. If you go beyond the 14th, you're in the 15th, aren't you? So what this means is the 14th is the day it's to be killed. But it does say between the evenings, or ben-ha or bayim. Ben-ha or bayim, between the evenings. And by the way, this can also be, can be translated between the settings. Between the settings. Speaking of the setting of the sun. What does all that mean, though? It's kind of foreign language to us. But it made sense to them. Between the settings. When is the first setting? Well, we all are familiar with high noon, aren't we? We know that noon is that time of day when the sun is directly overhead. It's right there at the highest point of the firmament that covers the earth, as it were. Right at the highest point of the sky. From our perspective, of course. We're not talking about from the point of view of astronomy and things like that. But from our perspective, that's the highest point. The moment as soon as it begins its descent, it climbs, we know not literally, but it climbs from the morning all the way to noon. It's at its highest point. And then when it begins its descent, that is the first setting. In other words, the beginning of the setting of the sun. The first setting is when it begins to descend. In other words, right after noon. And the second setting is when it drops over the horizon, when nightfall begins. So you have between the settings, or between the evenings. That's the understanding. And you'll find Hebrew scholars will agree to that. Jewish scholars who've observed these things for years and years, they understand that. And it certainly fits. It certainly fits because you see in Numbers, I believe it's Numbers 28. Let me look over there right quickly. Yeah. You see an example of this in Numbers 28. It's in Numbers 28. If you want to know, get an idea of what between the evenings means and whether or not it can refer to the narrow window of time at the beginning of the 14th, look at Numbers 28. And you say the same term translated here, but it refers to something else. It talks about, let me just read it very quickly. Verse 1 says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, command the people of Israel and say to them, my offering, my food for my food offerings, my pleasing aroma, you shall be careful to offer to me at its appointed time. And you shall say to them, this is the food offering that you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs, a year old, without blemish, day by day. This is the daily offerings. 2 daily offerings as a regular offering. This happened every day. regardless which day it was. It happened on the Sabbath. It happened every day of the week. It happened on the high days. On the day the Passover was offered, this was also offered. But day by day, as a regular offering. The one lamb, meaning the first one of the day, the one lamb, the first of the day, you shall offer in the morning. Well, that makes sense to offer an offering in the morning, doesn't it? That's the first one of the day. And the other lamb, that would be the second one of the same day, shall offer at Binha or Bayim, between the evenings. Same term used in talking about. So does it make sense that this one offering would be offered in the morning and the other a different day? The beginning of the next day? No, it would be a different day. It obviously means the latter part of the day, doesn't it? It's obvious. And that's what it means when he talks about the Passover. Now, I've had a couple of people over the years want to argue that the expression between the evenings means between the evening that begins the day and the evening that ends the day. I said, you mean that it means the whole 24-hour period? Well, yeah, from evening to evening. So why not just say, why say that? What's the point? So that means the morning sacrifice had to be offered in the morning, but the evening to evening sacrifice, any old time you want to, you can offer it before the morning if you want to. But that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? It obviously refers to the latter part of the day. And it makes sense from given its usage, it would refer simply to what we call the afternoon, up until sundown. So, well, let's continue on there. In verse 7 says, Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and lintels of the houses in which they eat it, meaning the Passover lamb. They shall eat the flesh that night. Now, if it's offered in the latter part of the 14th, then when is that night, using a sunset to sunset reckoning of days? That night would be the night of the 15th, wouldn't it? So it's to be eaten that night. Roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it, meaning the lamb. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts, and you shall let none of it remain until the morning. That takes a little while to roast a lamb like that. It takes a while to roast a turkey. To roast a lamb like that with its entrails intact, its head and everything, it takes a few hours to get that job done. And so here, if they killed it in the early part of the 14th, they're going to be roasting for a while, through the night. But no, they killed it in the latter part of the 14th, and then they began roasting the lamb. And then even then, by midnight, they were eating it. This is what happened in the original event in Egypt. By midnight, they were eating. And of course, this was while the terror was going on outside. In this manner, you shall eat it with your belt. Now this is very important. Why in the world, if they waited around all day, if this was done on the 14th, in the beginning of the 14th, and death passed through the land at midnight on the 14th, and then the next day, they hadn't left yet, and they're not going to leave until the next night, which is the old traditional way of explaining this. What on earth does this mean when it says, in this manner you shall eat it with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. I will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both men and beast. And of all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. What's the point? Normally, when they were indoors, they took their sandals off. Normally, they weren't dressed to go. They took the belt off. Why are they dressed for travel? Put on the belt so you can gird the loins. Pull up your little skirt that you're wearing, and that the men wore back in those days. back when men wore dresses, they're doing that again nowadays. But they put on the belt. In other words, be dressed for travel, to get out in a hurry. Now, this idea that here that night death passed over, Pharaoh gives the decree, and they stuck around for hours and hours afterward, all day on the 14th, and didn't leave until the night of the 15th. Why be eating this thing ready to go? What's the point? What's the point? Or for that matter, even if they did begin leaving that morning, suppose death passed over, and since it says that you're not to go out of doors before morning, and then when Pharaoh sends the word and the Egyptians start pressing on the people to get out now, say if it's 2 o'clock a.m., you're standing there with your staff in hand and your sandals on and ready to go. He said, nope, we got a few hours till sunup. I can't leave yet. That doesn't make sense, does it? So the idea is that you're going to leave in haste. You're going to be thrust out of the land of Egypt. They're going to insist that you go now. That's what's going to happen. And so they're ready to travel. So the idea that there's a whole 12-hour period between, during this intervening time, between the time they're told to get out and the time they actually leave, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So anyway, continuing on, he says in verse 14, this day, which day? Which day has he been talking about so far? Well, he just has talked about the sacrifice of the Passover, the lamb, the eating of that sacrifice. You could call that the sacrifice of the Passover, and followed by the Feast of the Passover, which took place that night. He says, this day. I would say he's talking about the same day, wouldn't you? This day shall be for you a memorial day. So, happy Memorial Day, everybody. This is a Memorial Day. Shall be as a memorial day, and you will keep it as a feast of the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever, and you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days, so it's not just the first day. The 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day till the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly. That's what we're doing here today, a holy convocation. And on the 7th day, a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, now here's something else that comes to mind some people don't pay any attention to. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, or you're reading the King James, 14th day at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even, or at evening. Now, what does 14th day of the month at even mean here? Then he goes on to say, for 7 days no leaven is to be found in your house. How do you count that? If you start with the 14th. Let's assume 14th day of the month at even means beginning of the 14th. Then what would 21st day of the month at even mean? Beginning of the 21st, right? So from the 14th, the beginning of the 21st to the 20th, you got 7 days there for sure, because the 21st is left out. But wait a minute, we're already told that the 15th day of the first month is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So why does it say here the 14th day of the month at evening? Because that's not the beginning of the 14th. It is the end of the 14th. And you know what happens when the 14th ends? The 15th begins. Man, we got a genius in here. The 15th begins. And then it says until the 21st day of the month at even, or in the evening. That means the 21st has just ended. When you end all the way through the 21st. That's what it means. So why would we think that 14th day of the month at even, when it's used elsewhere, for example in the book of Joshua, referring to the Passover, why would we think it means something different? It doesn't. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel. whether he is a sojourner or native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwelling places you shall eat unleavened bread. So even those people dwelling among them who were not Israelites, they were to follow this as well. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you, now here's the command. Some people see this as an immutable divine command that must be observed and cannot be broken. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning. You see, the argument goes like this, and it's covered, by the way, in this lead article in this magazine here, or this newsletter, whatever you want to call it. This is covered, but nevertheless I'll mention it here. The argument is that since nobody was to go out of the house until morning, and morning means the first light of day, nobody's to go out of his house. Thus says the Lord, nobody is to go out of his house until the morning. That means that they had to stay indoors. If it was offered, I'm arguing from the point of view of the early 14th. This is what the early 14th proponents would say. So since they couldn't go out before morning, and yet in Deuteronomy 16 verse 1 it says they said that they were brought out of Egypt by night, then it couldn't have been on the 14th. It had to be the next night. So that you had to have 2 different nights. Passover had to be on one night, and the departure from Egypt had to be on another night. That's the argument. But first of all, who says that morning begins with the first light of day? That may be the way you normally think about it. Most people do in our culture, and I think in ancient cultures. But is it possible that they might have had watches in the night back then? You know, back then, or in ancient times, they didn't. The days were, you had hours of the day. You had watches at night, and the morning watch, it was between about 2 and 6. It's still dark at that time. It's still night, but it's still considered a part of the morning, just like it in our culture. From midnight onward is part of the morning, isn't it? Well, just because it's still nighttime doesn't mean it's not considered morning, even then. So they could have still been thrust out of the land and not be in violation of this, because just because it was night, it could still be a part of the morning. You understand what I'm saying? So, but nevertheless, that aside, suppose this is simply a general command. Don't do what you would normally do at night. People did a lot of things out of doors at night. They'd go over and borrow something from a neighbor. They had activities at night, sitting around the fire or something and hearing Grandpa tell stories or whatever. They couldn't watch television, and looking up at the starry night and just chatting and talking and enjoying being together. A lot of things you did out of doors at night. And what he could be saying here simply is that don't do any of your normal activities out of doors. You stay in the house till morning. It's a general statement. Now suppose though, why do they need to stay indoors, do you think? Especially the firstborn, they needed to stay in there. Why? Because if they went outside, they could get killed. That's a good reason for staying indoors. But suppose the danger had passed. Suppose God had made it clear to Moses through Pharaoh or by direct revelation that the death angel had already killed everybody the death angel was going to kill, and now Pharaoh had released the people and the danger was past as far as the death angel is concerned. Or were they to say, well, we have this immutable, unconditional command that we've got to stay indoors? No. That's silly, isn't it? It's not an immutable command. It's a command that has purpose behind it. The danger is now past, so why not go out? Especially if God says, time to go. If He sends word by the things that He's doing in Egypt, it's time to go. So these arguments like that, they just don't hold water after you start to really analyze them. So none of you shall go out of the door of the house until the morning. But nevertheless, they were thrust out. And I would say if you had people banging on the door saying, get out of here, we want you out now, I think there's a good chance that you'd be inclined to leave, especially if you knew that Pharaoh had released the people because the danger was now past. It says, for the Lord, it goes on to, well, we read that earlier, you shall, at verse, now drop on to 24, you shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children, this is important, I think this plays to, at least helps us to answer the question that the critical scholars today will pose to you. You read this story and you think, did that really happen? Because it simply doesn't sound like things that happen from day to day in our world, is it? These plagues befalling Egypt, parting of the sea, all these things happening, taking place, God obviously orchestrating the events. So obviously people have doubts about this. Say, well, that sounds like a legend. It sounds like a story that was passed on down, a fictional story that was passed down from generation to generation. And you have scholars today, many scholars, who will look back in history and say, there's no archaeological evidence that there was a crowd of Hebrews or Israelites living in Egypt, a big crowd like it's described here. There's no archaeological evidence that the parting of the Red Sea occurred. Nothing in the Egyptian record from the time of Ramses II, which is believed to be the time that Moses lived. Nothing in the record there. So it simply obviously didn't happen. That's what you'll get that from the scholars. You'll get that. You find it in some commentaries. They say, well, the real truth is hidden beneath all the myth. The real truth is, the real lesson here is liberation. That's the real lesson. So you can take these fictional stories and understand the lessons from them. But, it's told like it's the truth, isn't it? And when I see Jesus describing things in the Old Testament, he takes them as historical fact. And he would take this, undoubtedly, as historical fact. There really was a guy named Moses, or Moshe, and he really did do the things that God describes here for him to do. And God really did act in history. But here's the thing about it. There actually is a lot of archaeological evidence, but it is not in the time of Ramses II. It's in an earlier time. And who says it had to be in the time of Ramses II? That's what they settled on. Ramses II, if there was an exodus, it must have happened in the time of Ramses II. And we don't see any evidence for an exodus in the time of Ramses II. So it didn't happen. What if there's evidence earlier? There is evidence. There's massive evidence that these things actually happened. I say massive evidence. There's significant evidence that there was a big crowd of people who were thrust out of Egypt. Not in the time of Ramses II, but sometime early, about 1500 BC. And just because you have reference to Ramses in the text, that's just some editor updating so the people reading it at the time would understand where the location was. For example, if I'm talking about the land of Ur, Abraham was the land of Ur. Everybody knows. Look, show me a map. Show that to me on a map. Where's Ur? You'd say, I don't know. No, so I might say Abraham was from Iraq. That's updating the information. So you have a reference to the land of Ramses in the Exodus account. That could simply be an update. I have no problem with the idea that someone after the time of Moses updated so the readers of the time could understand where they were dwelling. That's very simple, very simple. But in any case, there is evidence. There's archaeological evidence. But there's something else here, and it's mentioned right here in this story, that I consider to be powerful evidence. Let me read it. Verse 26. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron they did. You know, even in the times of Israel's unfaithfulness, there was always a remnant of people who never forgot these stories, even if the Passover was not being offered properly as instructed by the law. Even if it wasn't, there was a remnant in Israel, always, all the way back to Moses, who would tell their children about these things. And their children, this is what happened to my fathers. This is what happened to just maybe the last generation. My father was in this. My grandfather was in this. They remember these things. And there was always a remnant there who would tell the stories and pass it on. Down to this day, Jewish families to this day are still telling it. They didn't, somebody didn't come up with a legend, a story, an untrue story, and get that started along the way. When you have scattered Jews all over the world and they're all telling the same story about what happened to their ancestors in Egypt, it's because it was passed down from generation to generation to generation. And the story was told over and over and over again. That's how information, historical data was preserved in ancient times, because generations passed it down. They taught their children about the things that would happen. And God is saying here, don't ever lose sight of these things. And of course, in those periods of reform, when Israel got back on the, got back in the favor, and got back in favor with God, when they began to at least attempt to obey Him again, in those periods, of course, all of those things were revived. Those stories, those accounts of what had happened in Egypt. So to me, that is also a powerful piece of evidence. The fact that it was preserved from generation to generation, told and retold down to this very day. That's an important piece of information. It's like you have an eyewitness back there, and you have the generations after the eyewitnesses retelling the story. So continuing now with, it goes on to describe the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn. I'll just skip to verse 30. It says, and Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, now notice, they summoned them by night. It's still night when he summons them. It's still that night that the death angel passed through. He summoned them by night and said, now when it says he summoned them, I think what it most likely means, not that he called them to come to him, but he sent messengers to them. And go, he says, up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. Now I don't think he's saying, leave me a blessing. I don't think he's saying, I think he says, bless me also. I think what he means is, you'll be a blessing to be out of here. You'll be a blessing to me. Just bless me by going. Get out. And it goes on. And notice what happens here. The Egyptian says, oh no, please stay. We like you. We want you to stay. No, it says the Egyptians were urgent with the people. I don't see this as happening the next day, over in the next day, and then the next night they finally left. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste. Why is it called the bread of haste? Because you don't have time to let the leavening process work. If you're in a hurry and you want to have bread, it's going to be unleavened. If you don't have already in process the leavening going on. For they said, we shall all be dead. It says, now this is interesting here. It says, so the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel, and this is the part that's most interesting, the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them. Notice in this translation it says, had also done, not that they did at that moment. had also done. This refers back to chapter 11 and verse 1. But this is something apparently they'd already done, not something they're just now waiting to do. It says the people had done, according to what Moses had told them, they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold, jewelry, and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. It's not plundering in the sense we think of it, because they asked for it, and the Egyptians were happy to give it. Now, what could be happening here is it says they had asked for it already, so that's back in chapter 11 and verse 1. We won't go back there and read that. This had already been done, but it could mean also that they had already asked for these things. Maybe some of these items had already been given to them, but now that they're urgent on the people, saying, get out of our land quickly because we're about to all get killed because of you. Then they bring their gold and their silver as gifts and their clothing items. As they're leaving, as they're saying, get out, and here, take this as a gift. In other words, it's a way perhaps of preserving your own life in their way of thinking. If I give you this gift, I give you these things, maybe your God will be merciful. And so go, take this stuff and get out of here. That's what's going on here. And it goes on to say in verse 37, now here's a possible translational issue that comes up here. I talked about it last week in Tyler. If anybody that may have seen that, you already heard the explanation, but I'll just briefly touch on it here. It says, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth. In other words, and by the way, they didn't have to leave and go to a supply city called Ramses and leave from there. That's silly. They were in Ramses. They're already in Ramses. And you will see in in Numbers, I think it's 33, Numbers 33. We'll read that in a few moments, but in a little bit when we get to it. But anyway, it says there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. The translational issue here is the word translated thousand. It could be translated units, or simply regiments, or families, or something like that. It's a group. So it's not 600,000 men, it's 600 groups. And it's talking about men capable of going to war, 20 years of age and on up. You see that in Numbers chapter 1. We won't take the time to go there. I explored that last week in the sermon in Tyler. But there you have some of the same translational issues. But in any case, it may be that rather than a crowd of 2.4 million, there was really something like between 20 and 30,000. But you know what? When I think about 30,000 people, that's a big old crowd. That's a massive crowd. It's still a massive crowd. It may not be 2.4 million, but that's a huge crowd. So this is still a huge crowd. And the livestock that went with them, the livestock, and then evidently the multitude, the not counted, the mixed multitude that went out with them as well. But in any case, it was a big crowd. It says, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt. There it is again. They were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Finding an extra 12 hours in there is just kind of difficult for me to do. I know how people try to do that, but it just doesn't work. They were thrust out, and they were thrust out by night. They left by night. Pharaoh rose up in the night and sent word to Moses by night. So all of this is transpiring very quickly, just as God said it would, because they were thrust out. In verse 40, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. That's another issue. I'm not going to get into it, the number of years there, exactly when that begins. I won't go into it, like I said. But at the end of the 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts, this word hosts is a term that's used to refer to military organization. In other words, they went out in a very highly organized fashion. You see, that's another issue. Another issue. Some people say, well, how could they have just organized themselves up all of a sudden like that? They had to have time to do that. So here's what happened. They went to this supply city called Ramses, and they got there. It's 5 to 10 miles away, and they got there and organized themselves, and then they left that night. Well, none of that's in the text, of course, but my question is this. Why would we assume that they would need time to organize themselves? Why would we assume that they didn't already know how to do it? Why would we assume that these people that we know from when we read the rest of the account, read the book of Numbers, they never lost their tribal identity, did they? They all knew which tribe they belonged to. And you know, when they settled in Egypt, each of the sons of Jacob, they knew exactly who they were and who their families were. And when their families started growing, they continued to know who they were. And that's why they knew which tribes they belonged to. And I would surmise that in all probability, you had a home where you had, say, one of the sons of Jacob was in, and his family was there, and then the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. After a while, they'll have to build another home. So, that is, if you're the tribe of Judah, you say, why don't you go over there to the tribe of Issachar and build over there? No, you build next door or close by. And so you would have them probably in Egypt arranged by tribes already, living in areas where their tribe lived. And it's very possible, you see that in Numbers chapter 1, that they had signs, they had to identify the tribes. And they knew how to communicate far and wide because they understood something about the use of shofar. They understood how to do that. And so when they began to go out, it says that essentially what it's saying here, they went out in an organized fashion. As far as I'm concerned, it would not have been a great task to organize themselves immediately. As soon as they're driven out of their homes, they're told to get out. They leave in haste. They go out right there. Don't have to go to some supply city. Right there, right away. It's not hard for the heads of each tribe. Everybody knows who the heads of the families are in each tribe. It's not hard for them to follow the leader and to organize themselves as they're moving out. That's not an issue. The question that comes to my mind about the supply city scenario is, how'd they get there? They run out willy-nilly. So where are we going? So that doesn't solve anything, does it? The supply city scenario doesn't solve a thing. You mean they just ran out and just somehow they managed to get there, and that's when they organized themselves? No. I say that they could have very easily organized themselves as they were going out, and they were leaving in haste. None of that is contradictory. None of that requires much of an imagination to figure out. But anyway, I think that's what's going on here. Continuing on, well, he gives him further information concerning the Passover. This is how it's to be done later on, and it says it'll be done in one house. By the way, he says that it's a stranger, a sojourner. Probably has the mixed multitude in mind when it says this. A stranger and a sojourner will not keep the Passover with you. And it says if you have an uncircumcised person who wants to keep the Passover, then he has to be circumcised. So that was one of the rules. You could not keep the Passover unless you were circumcised. And he says there shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. So everybody who's going to keep the Passover has to be circumcised. But this language is interesting in verse 48. It says, if a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, then he may come near and keep it. What does that mean, come near? You know what come near means when it's used in these texts? What he has in view here, of course, remember, this was written quite a bit of time after the event. He's talking about coming near the holy place at the tabernacle, the place where the sacrifice was offered. Then he can come near and keep it. So this idea that the Passovers after Egypt were all domestic Passovers, you did it in individual locations like in Egypt, that's simply not true. It was a sanctuary-centered Passover. Everybody had to bring it to that one altar. Now, some people like the idea of a domestic Passover because that way you can squeeze all of the tens of thousands and potentially hundreds of thousands of Passovers into that one little narrow period of time, maybe 90 minutes between sunset and dark at the beginning of the 14th. But if you got everybody squeezing into that one area to bring their sacrifice to that one altar and put the blood on it, splash the blood against it, and if you got say 10,000 or 100,000 people, it's going to take a little time. So I think the whole afternoon is makes a whole lot more sense than twilight at the beginning of the period of the 14th. So anyway, he goes on to say, there shall be, as I said, the one law for the stranger and for you and the stranger dwelling among you. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses, and on that very day, there it is again, continue to talk about that day. This is the Memorial Day. That day the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. Now, Numbers 33 tells us exactly, if there's any question as to the stages of their sojourning, you got it in Numbers 33. And the intention of Numbers 33, the intention of the writer here, is to show exactly the stages of their exodus. It tells us in the clearest of terms. It says, these are the stages, Numbers 33, verse 1, these are the stages of the people of Israel when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting places stage by stage, and he didn't leave out the first one. Stage by stage, by command of the Lord, and these are the stages according to their starting places. They set out from Ramses. Again, not a supply city 5 to 10 miles away. That's where they lived. They set out from their homes in Ramses. In the first month, on the 15th day of the month. Which day? 15th day of the first month. On the day or the morrow after the Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all the Egyptians. Now, think about that. What does it mean when it says the morrow after? I've actually had people argue, say, well, that means 24 hours later. I said, no. Look through Scripture, you will see other examples of the morrow after. And what you will find is the same way we would use it. If you were talking about an afternoon event or a nighttime event, and you started talking about tomorrow, you would mean the next daylight period, wouldn't you? Yeah, that's what you would mean. So this is what this means. They went out on the 15th, and it says this was the day, the morrow after the Passover. So whether you take Passover to mean the afternoon of the 14th when the Passover Lamb was killed, or whether you mean the celebration that took place in the night of the 15th, or I should say I don't know if you could call it a celebration in Egypt because it's a night of terror, but what happened there, the eating of the Passover in the night of the 15th, the morrow after means the next daylight period, always. It doesn't mean the morrow. So I've had them say, no, this means all the way over to the next night. But no, it says they went out on the 15th, and it says the 15th was the morrow after the Passover. When does that put the Passover? In the late 14th, and then the eating of it then would have been in the early part of the 15th. Very clear. No question about it. On the day after, the morrow after the Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly on the side of the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn. Now, I don't think they started let me put it this way. Let me say this. I don't think when the Israelites started out, assuming they left while it was still dark, I don't think they got all the way out before sunup. No, I think they were still going. They were still moving. It's a good crowd of people. So they were still moving towards Sukkoth while the sun was now up. He says, I don't think the Egyptians started burying their dead while it was still dark. They probably waited till sunup. So they went out in the sight of the Egyptians while the Egyptians were burying their dead. That doesn't sound like a nighttime event. I think it was already sunup. Anyway, it's the morrow after. It's the morrow after this nighttime event or afternoon event called Passover. That would be in the daylight portion of the 15th by the time they're getting out of there. Even if they did start before dark. Before dawn, before daybreak. So while the Egyptians, it says, while they were burying their dead, whom the Lord had struck down among them, on their gods also the Lord executed judgments. So the people of Israel set out from Ramses, that's stage 1, and camped at Sukkoth. And from Sukkoth they went to Etham, and then it gives you the next stages of their journey. So it's very clear what we're talking about here, and you have to read a whole lot into it to make it fit the early 14th view. But nevertheless, you have this is my intention here is not to focus just on exactly when it was, but just to focus on what it was here that they were doing. And this is the point is this is a memorial day, a day to memorialize an event in history, a very important event in Israel's history, and of course that has significance for us. So the significance for us we see in over in the New Testament. Let's look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll try to wrap this up pretty quickly here. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul, speaking to a predominantly Gentile audience, this is interesting. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers, he seems to consider Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants to be also, in some sense, the fathers of these Gentile converts. Our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and were all baptized into Moses. In other words, what this means when it says they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, that means that their salvation, that is salvation from Egyptian bondage, was dependent on them following Moses. You can't be in that crowd facing the Red Sea and say, you know what? I'm not going this way. I'm going to go down here or up there where there's a land bridge. I'm going that way. And decide you're going to go to the promised land that way. No. You don't do that. Or if you think it's a little more shallow down there and you can wade across it, well, you're going to have that wall of water down there to deal with. That's not going to work either. So their deliverance, their freedom depended on their following Moses. They were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, perhaps symbolic of spirit baptism and water baptism. And all ate the same spiritual food. This does not mean immaterial food in this case. And all drank the same spiritual drink. What did they eat and drink? Well, they ate manna. Where did it come from? It was miraculously produced, wasn't it? And the water that came from the rock when Moses struck it, where did it come? It came from the rock, but where? How did it get out? How did it do that? It was miraculously produced, wasn't it? So when it says they all drank that spiritual drink and ate the spiritual food, what they're talking about when they say spiritual, what he's talking about here, he says these are supernaturally produced items. The things they ate and drank were supernaturally produced, for they drank from the spiritual rock. Now this is a little bit different here because he's talking about what produced them. The spiritual rock that followed or accompanied them, and the rock was Christ. So in this case, the spiritual rock was the supernatural rock that produced the supernatural, the items, supernaturally produced. And his point here is they look to Christ in a certain sense just as we do. Only, of course, we have the fullness of the revelation because Christ has come. He's died, has been raised, has ascended, and will come again. So we have a different perspective in that sense. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now here's the important part right here. All that's important, but here it becomes especially important to us. A lot of people look at those accounts and say, why are you focusing on the Old Testament accounts? Let's focus on the New Testament. Well, I am focusing on the New Testament when I'm reading these Old Testament accounts, because the New Testament tells us all about these and why they're important to us. And here's a case in point. Now these things took place as examples. The Greek word is tupoi. It means types. As types for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. In other words, these things were written down. Actually, not more than that, God was orchestrating events in ancient times, in the time of the Exodus and thereafter. He was orchestrating events in the life of this nation of Israel with our people, us today, Paul's generation, our generation, God's people later on down the road, with them in view. Why? And he inspired the writing down of these things. Why? So that those would serve as examples for us, so that we would learn from their experience. And we see the typology. We see them as types of us. Just as they look to Moses, we look to Christ for our spiritual sustenance. It says, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. So he refers to Exodus 32, an occasion of idolatry in the wilderness. And the reason he's doing this is because actually in the Corinthian church there was a problem with idolatry. And it was associated with participation at the idols' temples. In that pagan world, in the world then, it's very different from our world. You had pagan feasts, many pagan feasts, and you had feasts that were actually demanded of Gentile people, non-Jews. Jews had an exemption. They worked out things with Caesar. They had an exemption. They didn't have to participate in pagan customs. Gentiles, no, they did. They were required to by law. And if they were seen not participating, then they could get reported, and the imperial cult then could impose fines on them. That's why, by the way, why circumcision was so attractive. You wonder how in the world could a 30-year-old be drawn into this teaching, you need to be circumcised? How could that happen? Well, if you got an exemption from having to participate in the pagan festivals, then I can see how that might happen. That's what was going on there, no doubt. At least a part of what was going on. So you had a problem with idolatry in those days, and again, it revolved around the pagan temples and the pagan festivities of which Gentiles were required to participate, at least in certain regions, certain areas. So he's telling them, let these be your example. Flee from this type of thing. He goes on to give some more examples here. And he says now in verse 11, now these things happened to them as, again, the same word, tupoi, as types, but they were written down for our instruction. In other words, they weren't written down just to preserve history. That's a part of it too. But more than that, they were written down. God had it inspired the writing down of these things so that we, later generations of God's people, could be instructed and learn from their experience, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he falls. And that's the message there. Anyone who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. Because when we look at it, we realize, look at the meaning of this day, of this whole festival. We realize it is a feast of freedom. We're reminded that of the amazing grace that we sang about earlier. We're reminded of the freedom that we now have in Jesus Christ through His sacrifice, the Lamb of God who was offered for the sins of the world. So we have that as a reminder. We have the people of Israel as an example of people who also were redeemed and people who were saved by the blood, as it were, the blood of the Lamb, the Passover Lamb, and who were delivered, who were set free from the bondage of Egypt. So we were set free from the bondage of sin, of this world. And now then, even though we live in the world, as the Corinthians did, We have to keep in mind that we're not of the world. We live in the world. We're surrounded by the ways of the world. We're surrounded by influences, by things that could turn us away, to set us on the wrong path, and yet we're told to continue following the Lamb, continue following the new Moses, the new David, Jesus Christ, who is our Savior, the ultimate prophet like Moses, the ultimate David or Davidic king, the one who will ultimately deliver us from this present life of mortality into immortality in the everlasting kingdom and family of God. And so that's what this day reminds us. It reminds us to stay faithful, because we have been set free. Let's maintain that freedom. Let's make sure we do not fall back into the ways of this world. Make sure we do not fall back into sin and the things that would separate us from God, as Israel did. And remember that they were given to us, their story is given to us as an example. Let's follow that example. Let's remember that example and learn the lessons from it, and continue living this life that is depicted by this wonderful feast of freedom.